Welcome into the Sharp Report, boys and girls. My name is Matt Perrault. You guys normally see me on the Daily Juice podcast, but we did this about 2 years ago, where every month we had a conversation with insiders in the industry to give you a look behind the curtain as to how the industry is growing and where the industry is going. This conversation is going to be a lot of fun. Alex Kane is the CEO of Sporttrade. Well, what is Sporttrade? We'll get into Sporttrade. We'll get into the future of the industry and take a look back as to where we are. This company started in 2017, founded by Alex 1 year before the Supreme Court removed PASPA. Where are we? Well, let's talk to Alex about the future of sports betting here on the Sharp Report. Joining us now on the Sharp Report, Alex Kane, CEO of Sporttrade. Alex, great to see you. Thank you for the time. I appreciate you coming on today.
What's up, brother? Thanks so much for having me as always.
All right. So how did you get here? For people who don't know your history and your background, how did you become the CEO of one of the more interesting sports betting companies in America?
Yeah, so I was a student at Drexel University. I studied finance. I studied business law. I wasn't too familiar with betting, tangentially was involved, but never really had an account at Bodog or BetDSI or whatever. And I felt that as I learned more about sports betting, I learned more about how people were using it. This is back in 2016, 2017. And I juxtaposed that with how Robinhood felt as a user experience, to log in and see, okay, I'm worth $550 because I deposited $500 last week and I put it all on Apple and they're up 10% since their earnings. That sort of UI and UX felt super comfortable to me. I felt very approachable. And I felt that sports betting could really benefit from that sort of marketplacey, retail broker, trading type interface. And I think what great companies like Robinhood have proven is you can take something very complicated like a stock trade and make it simple. And I think what Sporttrade's tried to do is take something like sports betting and introduce a totally new way to think about it in a much simpler lens. And so that's what Sporttrade is. It's a prediction market. It allows you to, bet on and against sports outcomes using this probabilistic model. So just looking at a random sporting event, you might see that Scottie Scheffler has a 25% chance to win the US Open. So on Sporttrade, you can take the yes side, it's 25%. You're risking 25 to win 100. You could take the no side. You can risk 75 to win 100 that he doesn't win. But the most fun thing about Sporttrade is that once you have that initial bet, let's say you put $25 on Scottie Scheffler to win at 25% odds, each putt he makes and misses, each drive he hits or misses the fairway, the market is going to update the probability of him to win. And it's going to allow you to go back on Sporttrade and say, oh my gosh, I bought him at 25. He shot 66 in the first round. He's at 45% chance to win after just one round. Maybe I want to sell him. And you can do that. So that's what Sporttrade is. It sort of tries to blend the best parts about retail trading, retail brokerages, and electronic exchanges to create this brand new version of sports betting where your bet always has a liquid value and you can get in or get out at any time.
How do you guys see the future of this going? Because are we eventually going to get to the money-making portion of this, which is the parlay side of things? And that's going to be, and we saw a report that came out from ingame.com yesterday, and we're taping this here on the 30th of May, in which they did a whole analysis of Kalshi's handle and what their overall influence is. And from a revenue standpoint, they're about 0.5% right now because they're not offering what FanDuel and DraftKings are making most of their money on, which is same game parlays and parlays in general. Do we see prediction markets? Is Sporttrade looking at a way to try to find how you can include a parlay side of this business?
I think eventually, I think one of the great things about prediction markets is, we're as the marketplace, we're trying to build a brand new way of thinking about sports betting. And currently the way sports betting has existed, if you go back to 2019 and you were to plot the sort of hold percentage, so how much did books keep as a function of what was bet with them, over time each year, you'd see that, back in 2019, before the same game parlay really took a lot of notoriety, the hold was 6%. And then it was 7 in 2020. And then it was 8, 9, 10. Now it's close to 10 to 11% hold. I think prediction markets are going to reverse that trend. that like if you really want to create an industry that's like better for the consumer and is truly sustainable, we need to have that 10% go and asymptotically approach 1%. For as crazy as that sounds, which I think is going to be a shock to the system. It's going to be a shock to so many parts of the ecosystem, not the least of which are these incumbent operators. Because yes, over time, prediction market can start with who's going to win the game, who's going to cover the spread. These are singular outcomes where you can buy and sell throughout the game. But just like in financial markets, there are more complex instruments that aren't really traded the way that like IBM stock or Raytheon's stock is traded on the NASDAQ stock market. They're a bit more what's called over-the-counter products, where a bank or an institution or an individual comes to a venue and says, I'd like this somewhat complex financial instrument. Maybe it's a yield curve sort of product. Maybe it's an option product. Maybe it's a future product. Maybe it's a credit default swap, as the movie Big Short made very, very famous. Those were not traded on an exchange, Matt, right? They were traded over the counter. And in this over the counter sort of construct, while it's different from an exchange in that you're not able to always see a bid and an offer price, it's similar in that it's a marketplace. And so there are many different participants that can compete and have to compete to offer the most competitive price. So the person that's requesting this OTC product, whether it's a yield interest rate curve, or it's a credit default swap, or it's a parlay on an event contract or a sports bet, multiple market makers have to compete. And what's going to end up happening is even for these parlays, the hold is going to get driven down to a very, very, very small number. And that is so great for consumers. Historically, when we think about parlays, we think, well, it's a 6-leg same-game parlay. It must have a 20% hold. In this new world, 10 years from now, I think a 6-leg parlay is going to have a 1% hold. And I think that's just wonderful for consumers.
Before we go back, and I do want to take a history lesson and jaunt back into pre-PASPA and to the rollout of legalized sports gambling in America, how does Sporttrade, where do you see Sporttrade factoring into the current conversation with operators like Cut and Novig, who are peer-to-peer exchanges, but they're not doing the same prediction market, but they are a peer-to-peer exchange? Because is it fair to say that essentially a sport prediction market is a peer-to-peer exchange?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair way to put it, as long as we understand that peers can be anyone, not just individual people. Peers can be market makers, right? Market makers can be individuals. Market makers can be entities and groups of people. And I think what you're going to find in this new entrepreneurial class of the late 2020s here is that there's going to be so many iterations of this marketplace construct, because for this newer generation and for my generation, like, we came up with the Coinbases, with the Robinhoods, with the Weebles, with the Airbnbs, with the Ubers, with the DoorDashes, with this very, the one common thread is that these are all marketplaces. These are all places where there's not one, source of supply and many sources of demand. It's the opposite. There's many sources of demand and there's many sources of supply. It's a very, very different business model. And so I think you're just going to continuously see, when you see peer-to-peer, prediction market, betting exchange, for the most part, they share more commonalities, more similarities than they do differences.
So let's take a step back here to 2018 to today. So we are in 2025. We are only about 7 years into this new world of legalized sports gambling, or at least the option if you're a state that wants to have legalized sports gambling. We have now entered into this 50-state potential where Kalshi is opening up the idea that you don't have to have an individual state give you a license. Now we're talking about the entire country being wide open to a new company that might be stepping into this field. How would you grade the rollout of legalized sports gambling in America, and what would you have done differently looking back now on it if we could?
Yeah, it's I'd probably give it somewhere in the range of a C-. I think that the problem is historically, like, if you take a step back, like, historically gambling is this industry that like really doesn't play well with this concept of like open competition. Like just like even when casinos have to like want to go and operate in a state, like the state has to do this massive study and they bring in an outside consultant. They sort of understand, can the market sort of expand to this? Can it stomach this new competitor? What's going to happen to existing competitors? And that's because like gambling in the historical sense has really just been a transfer of wealth from people that want to gamble to like the state coffers in the form of tax revenue. And like that would never happen in another industry. Like imagine in like the the streaming business, like Paramount wanted to like launch its new streaming business, and like some federal regulators said like, oh, we have to see how like Netflix feels about this. We see how Hulu feels about this. Like so because of that sort of natural upbringing of the way gambling from a land-based sense has always worked, that thought process crept into how online sports betting bills came to be. All of these land-based incumbents, including tracks, tribes, for the most part, not really as much as casinos, teams and leagues, realized that they could exert a lot of influence and put their thumb on the scale to create what they thought was the best version of sports betting. And spoiler alert, that simply means the thing that was going to make them the most amount of money. And so when all these states came to be and all these bills started to come forward, you realize looking back, they're all written by casinos and leagues and teams and casino associations and horse tracks. And it created these immense barriers to entry. And you think about like the US market and like think about how ubiquitous sports betting was even before PASPA. Like it was a part of our fabric. People on ESPN talk about it. They say, oh, that was a really important field goal there. Everyone knows what they're talking about. There were still sports betting shows. Vegas was a destination, still is when we think about sports betting. It's a part of who we were. So it's only inevitable that countless American entrepreneurs are going to want to participate and build their own operators, build their own sportsbooks, build their own exchanges, build their own DFS platforms. And unfortunately, the reason I give it a C- is that those that had the most power at the time in the land-based casino sense wrote these bills in a way that forced all those entrepreneurs offshore. And that's wrong. And I think the better way to do it, to answer the second half of your question, would have been a federal construct, 100%, where you take all the power out of the leagues and the teams and to some extent, the tribes really do have exclusivity. And that's really important because the federal government has an agreement with the tribes right now. I think it's called IGRA. So keep that on the side for a second. The commercial casinos, the horse tracks, these are all entities that should have to fairly compete on level footing, as opposed to have inserted themselves as the de facto gatekeepers in a lot of ways of a lot of these markets. We see it all the time. It's called market access. It's euphemistically sort of referred to as. And that simply means you got to pay a casino to even then get a license to then operate, to then pay a crap ton of money to acquire customers and do all the really hard things. And so that's wrong. It's so anti-American. Regulatory capture is anti-American. And in a lot of ways, this 50-state construct that's now presented by the CFTC and Kalshi, while I don't particularly agree with the way it's happened, I think it presents a very nice counterbalance and a sledgehammer to the proverbial glass construct that is the way sports betting has come from 0 states online to now 38 states in some way, shape, or form, because it's just a construct that is, I wrote a letter about this, to open letter to regulators and legislators. It's so anti-American. It's so anti-consumer. It's so anti-entrepreneur. It's so anti-innovator. It's really pro-casino and pro-multinational big conglomerates that can absorb all these high fees and access costs. So that's why I give it a C-. Sometimes I wake up and it's a D. Yeah, C-.
So I'm in Nevada. So obviously this has been sort of the cradle of all of this. But if I live in a state that has no sports gambling regulated and it's all offshore and it's all in the black market, is that better for the average gambler? Not to say I want people offshore, but how do you mentioned the anti-American situation. I spend a lot of time in New Hampshire where there's a single operator, or in Florida where there's a single operator. is that even worse that we allowed states to roll out and have a single operator do a deal with the state and to have a monopoly?
It's horrible. It's just like so everything we're against. And it's crony capitalism. It's the government choosing winners and losers. And the consumer hurts because there's so many different versions of this. Some of these versions are so different that I do think they should be regulated differently, like an exchange versus a sportsbook model. But even setting that sort of, disparity aside, that distinction aside, there's so many different cool versions of this. Look at what Underdog's doing. Look at what Fliff is doing. Look at what Prize Picks is doing. Look at what some of these ancillary companies that sit adjacent to that. Look what Pickett's doing. BettingPros is doing. OddsJam is doing. Unabated. These are all companies that should be able to participate in a much more meaningful way. And unfortunately, there's so much red tape that's inserted by those that stand to lose the most if this is truly A, an open and competitive environment, but B, sports bettors are actually informed, not just from a price perspective, but what sort of bets probably should you stay away from or maybe only spend the funny money on versus what sort of bets are you losing the least on. And that's sad to see. So yeah, a state like Florida, it's really a shame that there's really only one legal option. And now with the emergence of this federal construct, there's more consumer choice, and it's hard so long as the company isn't brazenly breaking laws. It's hard to be against this concept of competition. There are limitations to that, and I certainly have my own distinctions and lines, and everyone has their own lines in the sand as to where they draw that. But for the most part, it's hard to support a construct where customers only have one option, especially if those customers are good at what they do and they find themselves not able to fully immerse themselves in the only option that's afforded to them in a legal perspective.
I guess we can jump into this now because it's my number one question about, we have states that have decided to either A, pass legalization laws and give you an actual path towards becoming a legalized sports gambling operator, or we have states that have decided we're not going to give you an option to go and become a legalized sports getting operator. But now we've got social sports books, we have peer-to-peer exchanges, we have Kalshi that comes in and doing, and we'll get to them here a little bit more specifically in a second. But how do you feel about the Coinbase systems? How do you feel about the social sports books? Because they're kind of getting a pass, right? We've spent a lot of time in the last 6 months, I believe, talking about Kalshi, talking about their CFTC interpretation of the laws, saying they're the only ones that can police us. And we haven't really put the spotlight heavily on, well, you mentioned Fliff, you mentioned these are operators that are pulling big amounts of money out of states like California and Texas. And in fact, they're marketing into those states as saying, hey, we're legal. This is sports betting light. Come play with us. What's your take on the way that they're approaching it? Because it may not be blatantly illegal, but it feels like there's something going around the law that's going on.
Yeah, I think my viewpoint on this is that at the end of the day, in the long run, operators that want to be successful are going to have to, and want to sell their business, right? We all, in theory, we all get into this because at some point we want to, change the world, and we want to create great user impact, user experiences, and we want to create a lot of value. But some of us may want to sell our business, right? And it's going to become, I think, increasingly hard to do that in that social and sweeps world, because it would be fair to say that there's been some degree, maybe not as much as Kalshi and the CFTC sort of constructs have intercepted and intersected with, but there's been some momentum from a legislative perspective on a state by state basis to address these social and sweepstakes sports books. I think, just like everything else, there's a range of these companies. There's companies that are more on the brand new side that are saying, hey, this is, sports betting light, and maybe aren't super thoughtful about, well, technically you're, a sweepstakes sponsor, and which means that there's real tax implications to that when, your consumers withdraw money, redeem money, like, the amount that you're redeeming is income because you're not risking anything. That's the whole concept of being a sweepstakes sponsor. Or that when you sell these tokens, many of these states, that those token sales are subject to sales tax. And I think just like in every other industry, you have sort of really mature businesses that are looking at sweeps as a multi sort of regulatory strategy of like, hey, how do I introduce my product to players in California and in Texas, but overall and in time, I want to be a bit more regulated, versus companies that are saying, hey, we'll figure it out later. This is a way for us to operate in a lot more states. And with those two strategies, you might find a slightly different approach to adhering to the rest of the rules that now would, you are subjected to by virtue of calling yourselves a sweepstakes sponsor. So it's not something Sporttrade, has really thought about, because again, the tax thing for us, like we're a very low margin business model. And so we pay already about 2% of the amount of money that's deposited with us on the net in terms of payment processing costs. And that makes up close to a quarter of our revenue, as you'd believe it. So when you think about these gross gaming revenue taxes and what's fair and what's not, you got to keep in mind there's a lot of other sort of percentages of that revenue that are already going out the door before taxes even hit. Some of these states that charge 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% sales tax, that would be another, let's say on the net, 8% on top of the 2% you're paying for the deposit. So now you're paying 10% on every purchase or deposit. That's just not feasible for us as a business. We would not be able to make any sort of positive revenue after our direct costs. So yeah, we've always tried to, I think for better or worse, trying to do things the right way. And so when we look at these potential avenues, we say, okay, there maybe is a real use case in some of these states for sweeps, but then you look at the rest of what that means to really be a sweepstakes operator through and commit to that. There are tax implications that just make that impossible for us. So we're swimming in our own lane. It's something we've evaluated, but after having done that, an evaluation, we looked at it and said, well, we can't do it. Won't make any money. So you're gonna find a spectrum, and there's some companies that pay that sales tax and do all those sort of things and have all of these regulatory helpers and consultants, and they're on the up and they're very legitimate business. And then there's those that maybe Sporttrade, if we were 7 years late, we didn't have a lot of money, we'd have gone into that. We probably would have been the company that maybe said, well, we'll figure out the sales tax thing later, right? We got to build a business first. So it's just not where we are in our trajectory. Wouldn't have been able to make that jump.
You mentioned the letter that you wrote about what's going on in the sport prediction market and how it's gambling. And you've been very clear by saying, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that this is not gambling. This is gambling. Do we need the federal government to define what is gaming from a sports betting perspective, to clear all of this up when it comes to the social sports books, when it comes to the social casinos, when it comes to the sport prediction markets, the sports books in general? Are we racing towards that where we have to define what this is in order to properly have laws in place?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, and it's defined in so many different ways in so many different states. And it's certainly been a real challenge. I think, the comment I made about, I think I mentioned to Dan at Sportico, is I said, you're not going to particularly hear me go and make the argument that this isn't sports betting. And the point I was trying to make there is that I think when we think about the potential distinction in terms of how companies that are operating more like an exchange versus a sports book should be regulated, should be taxed, who they should be regulated by, the reasons why that's the case isn't because one is gambling and the other isn't. I mean, that doesn't like, the sky is blue. Okay. The sun will come up tomorrow. Like, there are certain definite realities in this life. And I feel like to say, well, one is gambling and one isn't is probably wrong. However, there are real distinctions, right? There are real distinctions between how this product operates in an exchange and a sports book. And I think Sporttrade's limit that in a lot of ways in going to these states and saying, okay, well, all right, you're risking money to win money. Sports is involved. All right, here we are. We're going to try to get a license. And so many of the things that we've tried to do, how do market makers operate? How can players plug in electronically via what's called an API and trade programmatically. These are all issues that really haven't been, how is revenue recognized and reported? These are all things that very squarely fit and only fit a sports book. And an exchange is sort of left on the outside saying, well, wait a minute, revenue equals bets minus bets paid. That doesn't really, well, how does that work? And how does the federal excise tax work? If you start to bet against multiple golfers, you're technically not taking risk as soon as you bet no in the second golfer. So how is that reported? Where does a market maker fit in all this? So I think that there's so much nuance there that I do think there would be a benefit to creating some level of distinction. However, like you, I'm probably not holding my breath for that to happen anytime soon.
Because if we aren't going to define what gaming is or what gambling is, what sports betting is, how do we exist in a world where the internet and innovation needs to be embraced and pushed, because that's where everything lives? I mean, so many of us, including myself, I used to go to a radio studio to go to work. I haven't gone to a radio studio in 5 years. Right. I've been working every day for 5 years, but I have never gone into an actual studio because the internet allows me to do this very interview with you in Philadelphia and me in Las Vegas. What do we do about archaic laws, namely the Wire Act? Like, what do we do with these things that have been on the books since 1961 when nobody envisioned the current way we do business?
I think this is the two-part answer. Part one is that there are certain rules, laws, I would say, like that no longer fit the current regime. Like that was a law that was meant to go after like organized crime.
Yeah, the mob.
The mob, right? The mob.
Chicago and Las Vegas. It was passed literally to go after that,
right? And these mobs made a considerable amount of money with setting up these wire rooms, and transferring the information of all these bets and how to move the lines and what's the results and all these sort of things. And that was used as a tool, as a mechanism to go after organized crime. So using it to go after a company that pays a lot of taxes and hires people and pays payroll taxes and has a corporate office and people show up to work and it creates a lot of economic value. Like, not exactly, I don't think that wasn't the intention. And so I think there's some of those sort of things that definitely need to be addressed. I think the second part of the question, though, is the more interesting part, which is when you think about a regulator like the CFTC, right, the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission, that is a principle-based regulator. It's a principle-based set of regulations, a principle-based regime. And look no further than the 23 core principles of the CFTC. So when you do a DCM application, you have to sort of demonstrate how what you do fits and complies with the core principles. It's directional. It's what's called risk-based regulation. And unfortunately, in the U.S., state-by-state online sports betting and land-based sports betting and land-based casino gaming world, it's very rules-based, which is the opposite, which isn't like, hey, I'm going to tell you generally how to treat customers. Generally, we shouldn't be doing things like this. We need to be sort of reporting in this way. Rules-based, the opposite. You need to do it exactly this way. So if you operate like a casino with a poker room, you need to have exactly 19 cameras and they need to be set up in this orientation in this way. I mean, this is very, I had a former commissioner at the Ontario Gaming Control Board who had told me that when he came and he transformed Ontario's before legalized sports betting there, which I think happened in April 4th, 2021 or 2022. That's what it was, April 2022. He transformed an entire regime from a rules-based regime to a risk-based regime. And you look at Ontario and you say, it's got 30, 40, 50 operators. It's got operators like Pinnacle, who have never thought to come in the US, but are operating in a legal market right now in Ontario, because a principle-based, risk-based way of regulating is so much better. Because to answer your initial point, when things change and new technologies come, and it was the internet, and now it's going to be AI, and who knows what the next thing's going to be, the regulators are already set up for success. And they say, I don't care how you do it. I don't care what exactly you do. You need to fit with directionally how I want customers to be treated, how I want you to report on activity, how I want you to react when bad things happen. Here's a framework to follow. And I think it would behoove state legislators to start to make that switch, to say, you know what, we are just tying two hands behind our regulators' back because we're going to give them this rule set. And then here comes sweeps, here comes DFS 2.0, here comes prediction markets, and they're left absolutely not able to do anything, right? I would love to change my rules, Alex, but I can't. We're a very rules-based system, and I can't change those without legislative help. What legislators need to do is they need to give those regulators a lot more breathing room to create a principle-based approach. So I think that's the answer. And you look at something like the CFTC, that's a commission that has lasted a long time through many types of different products. And it's hard to recount a ton of scenarios where even in the FTX scenario, in that whole debacle, FTX, a subsidiary of FTX, was Ledger X. Ledger X was what was called a DCO, a derivatives clearing organization. It regulated by the CFTC, and not a dollar was touched because they were able to demonstrate that they followed the core principles of the CFTC, and they kept all dollars that were held by consumers completely separate. So whereas in other jurisdictions, they went and spent a lot of users' money on these risky investments, the U.S. customers, U.S. and retail investors' money was safe. And so isn't that enough to say that the CFTC way of doing it is adequate? Because it has stood the test of time. It has rode out these storms that would have rocked customers in other states from the jurisdictions from the exact same company. So that's the answer. The problem is it's hard to, people like to have this control and they like to say, I want you to do this. It's a power trip thing. And I think it's harder to sort of let go and say, you know what, I really trust those that are going to come in and do all the work to get regulated and give them a directional idea of how I want them to operate. It's much easier as a legislator to say, I want the reporting to look exactly like this. If this goes in this spot, I mean, we've had examples at Sporttrade where, I'm not going to say the state, where we say, hey, we give out bonuses, but when we do it, we don't make you play through it. We think it's more honest and fair. We just give you the money. And in a certain state, they said, well, actually, that doesn't fit within any of our descriptions. So you don't get the tax benefit of writing that off like the other operators do, even though those other operators make you play through it. So it's sort of a double whammy because it didn't actually fit in any of the boxes. Whereas a principle-based regulator would say, directionally, you're giving a promo. You're not making the customers play through it. That's even better. Setting that aside, I'm just going to put that under the promos column. I don't need it to have it be clearly defined by a legislator for me to make that determination. That's the difference. That's why it would be a lot better.
I've already kept you longer than I said I was going to, so I just want to get to one more topic before we go too long here, because I think it's kind of dovetailing into what we're talking about, because it's the education of the American bettor. Price discovery is something that, as you get into gaming and gambling, you start to look at, 6-5 blackjack. You start to go and get, okay, I don't like that. I want 3-2 blackjack. You play enough, eventually price will come into play because the longer you play, you got to watch the price because you're going to basically, the odds are already stacked against you. You're trying to stay in the game for as long as you can. How do we educate the average American gambler that price matters? Is it just give it time and we'll get there eventually, and eventually people will figure it out? Or is there something we can do either in the media, in the content space, from a regular standpoint? How do we educate the American gambler better when it comes to price?
I think it's really hard to do. And I think it's because a lot of people look at sports betting as an entertainment thing. I think that what this massive shift that's happening right now with these prediction markets is that for the first time ever, you actually have these companies that are very large, that have a lot of money, that believe in this sort of exchange model. And the exchange model takes care of the price thing because it doesn't let anyone get a raw deal, because all the people that can offer price just undercut each other until the prices offered are so fair. And that's what's so exciting about a company like Robinhood saying, no, we're going to do this, but we're going to do it with the exchange model. We believe in it. It's transparent. It's fair. And so I think as that gains a lot of notoriety, which I expect it will over the coming 3-4 years, I think it can start to be very easy to compare on price, because the way these exchanges and brokerages make money is with a commission, and it's in your face. And they say the commission is 1% or 1 cent. And that's a lot easier. If every sportsbook just offered you a plus 100 bet and then said, our markup is 5% versus BetMGM's markup is 7% versus Bet365, they're only 3%. That is now very easy to look at, because you don't have to use any math whatsoever. 3 is less than 5 is less than 7. And so I think the world's going to change. I think we're in the middle of a paradigm shift, and I think it's going to get easier to see what the price impacts are, because the broker or the exchange are going to have to show you like, hey, this includes a commission of X. And now you as a consumer are only comparing X. It's why Robinhood was so successful 15 years ago, because they said, we're going to be the first broker to charge 0 commissions. Well, all of a sudden, everyone was price sensitive, whereas they really weren't price sensitive before, because they made it super clear. Hey, they're charging you $7.99 a trade. I'm going to charge you 0. And when you bake it down to something that simple, as opposed to like, wait, plus 360, but I have to go on all these other apps, plus 380. Okay, plus 380 is better in this case, but in that case, it's going to be better for this other get bet. So I guess I have to keep money in multiple platforms. With these exchanges and brokerages, you can say this one charges 1% commission and this one charges no commission. So I'm just going to use this one. I'm not going to use the one that charges 1% commission. And all of these things are extraordinary for customers, because at the end of the day, 3 years from now, the average NFL money line spread total is going to be, including fees, plus 100 minus 101. It's just going to be absolutely bonkers. And so I'm here for it, and I'm really excited.
In 3 years, we're going even money 101 on every NFL game? Yes.
Yes. I want to see what the great consig maybe minus 101, minus 101, but something like so ridiculously amazing that, I have to watch what I say here, but if you kind of know what you're doing, you can essentially gamble for 0 edge. You could sort of put your $10 down on out of your favorite 4 or 5 games every week and kind of get, just like if you only did stock trading, you didn't do options, you didn't do any of the complex financial stuff, and you only submitted stock trades, like you kind of pay 0 fees now, because that world's so competitive. There's so many brokers, so many exchanges, so many market makers. If that ends up happening with sports betting, not only is minus 110 dead, minus 105 is just as dead as minus 110. And now you're looking at, if you looked at the game and it's minus 102, minus 102, like that's about as expensive as it's going to get, which is, think about that. Like for me is better. Like I would love, if you give me minus 101 on everything, like what's the point of price shopping? I just like, here's my 6 game. Like imagine betting your favorite Eagles minus the points. Hopefully they're going to be covered, either favoring more than 10 to 12 games this year. Imagine taking the Eagles every week, minus 3.5, minus 102. It's like, or minus 101 or plus 100. That's what we're talking about here. And I think, for some of these companies, like BettingPros included, like, oh my God, what an incredible opportunity to like show people what the future of this could be, because I think we're entering such a transformational time that between now and 5 years ago, everything's still minus 110. Like you go on all these apps, 5 years from now, no chance, absolutely no chance you're going to go off on a Sunday afternoon or Sunday morning, you live in Vegas and see minus 110 everywhere. Like that is so dead.
Wow. Well, that's the future, Alex. Before we let you go here, in the present, the states that Sporttrade is currently operating in, where are you? Where can folks find information about Sporttrade to use the app?
Yes, so we are live in New Jersey, California, New Jersey, Colorado. Wish California, that would be breaking news. New Jersey, Colorado, Arizona, Virginia, and Iowa. You can find us by typing in Sporttrade. We're coming out with our web platform this summer. We're coming out with our charting feature in just a couple of days, which is super exciting. We like to say you could trade, the winner on Kalshi and Robinhood. You can trade anything on Sporttrade, including will there be a run in the first inning, where you could see those trend lines go up and down and change with every pitch. And so I really think that's the future of betting for a lot of customers. And so we've got to figure out a way to get it national very quickly here. But for those that are in those states or those that know people in those states, check it out, because I really think it's a platform that you're going to look and say, wow, I've never experienced anything like this before. And of course, would love to hear your feedback and hear how we can improve.
He is Alex Kane, the CEO of Sporttrade. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. This was an unbelievable conversation. Thank you for the time today.
Thank you.